Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Apologies, more AUKUS stuff. Even I'm getting a bit sick of AUKUS, but there have been some developments that I'd better mention. I had been hoping to talk about other things, such as the journalist and analyst David Sanger speaking at the National Press Club last week. But then the letter that President Joe Biden sent to Congress on AUKUS has appeared, and hopefully I'll get to David Sanger a bit later. And remember, for starters, we are once again learning more about AUKUS from the US rather than from our own government, which I think is a total disgrace. Now, the letter from President Biden, which is mainly about regulatory stuff concerning the sharing of information about nuclear reactors, contains the following sentence that has, thankfully, received some coverage, but not nearly as much as it deserves. That's probably not helped by this thing called the Olympic Games at the moment, which has swamped everything. Anyway, the crucial part reads, the trilateral partners also concluded a non-legally binding understanding, blah, 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 which reflects the government's, plural, intended approach to certain articles of the agreement and provides additional related political commitments. Now, at least whatever this is, it's not binding, it says, but what are these additional related political commitments? Now, some media and political speculation has been about things like a secret agreement to go to war against China or the storage of high-level nuclear waste from countries other than Australia, in Australia. Paul Keating has come out of the woodwork again with his usual fiery denunciation of AUKUS, and I don't mind that happening because at least it's drawing attention to people of the whole idea rather than just brushing the stuff under the carpet. Anyway, I'll just digress for a moment with Taiwan. It's an important issue, and it's slightly more nuanced than most commentators, and it would seem politicians don't understand or willfully misrepresent. Now, there are actually two different scenarios in play, but 99% of people hear the words Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which sounds outrageous, and it is. However, what seems to trigger Beijing, no pun intended, and I'm not a China expert, is the fear of Taiwan unilaterally declaring independence. In Beijing, they tend to see everything through that particular prism and go berserk any time something happens that they interpret as encouraging such a declaration. Now, my own view, and I suspect that this would be a majority view around the world, is that if China simply launched an invasion tomorrow that was unprovoked, that would be completely wrong and should and would be resisted. What that resistance might look like, of course, is a matter of conjecture, but I think that the country that would react fastest would actually be Japan, even before the US jumped in. Japan and Taiwan have a close history, and Taiwan was a Japanese colony between 1894 to 1945. The Japanese, generally speaking, treated Taiwan fairly decently, unlike, for example, their treatment of Korea during the same sort of period. Anyway, because of Japan's proximity to the Ryukyu island chain, and part of that, Yonaguni Island is only about 100 kilometers from Taiwan, I very much suspect that a Chinese occupation of Taiwan itself would be far too close for comfort to Japan, and I wouldn't be surprised if that message has been conveyed on the quiet to Beijing. Now, also to be clear, I like and admire Taiwan. It's a vibrant democracy, and it's trying to be a good global citizen supporting various humanitarian efforts. It also has a complex history, such as being Portuguese colony before its sort of 17th century inclusion as part of China, and that gives it a status something not exactly equivalent to one of the big mainland provinces. So if China launched an invasion, then I think there's a good case to be made for joining with the US, Japan, and South Korea in resisting that. However, what isn't discussed, and I'm not sure why, maybe it's sheer laziness, is what if it's a completely different scenario and a future Taiwanese government ignores all of the warnings from Beijing and unilaterally declares independence because some hotheads in Taipei have misinterpreted signals of support from countries. What would the rest of the world, particularly Australia, do in that case? And for me, that's far less clear. Taiwan has prospered under the status quo, and if it consciously decided to overturn that particular apple cart, should Australian lives be put at risk because of that Taiwanese internal decision? I think the case for intervention in those circumstances is far less clear, and we might be better off sitting it out. Anyway, this has strayed a bit from AUKUS, but you can blame the ambiguity in President Biden's letter for that. As mentioned, another interpretation of the secret political agreement could be the storage of high-level radioactive waste from other countries, and here I think the media have once again totally missed the point. By jumping on this and allowing the government to scoff and instantly deny the possibility, it overlooks the obvious fact that Australia has already agreed to store a considerable amount of nuclear waste, high-level nuclear waste, coming from the submarines we will acquire. Now, this will amount to many tons, maybe hundreds of tons, of highly radiated material from the submarine's reactor compartment, as well as all of the truly horrendous uranium-235 that is the power source, and which is one of the most toxic substances ever created. It's also the stuff that makes nuclear warheads go bang. So Australia is already going to have to build a vast, highly secure facility somewhere. And to me, it's completely irrelevant if, as well as Australian-owned U-235 being stored there forever, it eventually also houses some of this awful material from the UK and the US. It makes no practical difference because the damage will already have been done. I'll make the further point about timelines, the comments from Richard Marles, again verging on the bizarre that we still have plenty of time to work all of this stuff out. If we actually do end up with second-hand Virginias, they will presumably be ones constructed between 2010 and 2020. Now, the S9G reactors have a life of 33 years, so that means that they will be decommissioned sometime between 2043 and 2053. Now, planning needs to consider worst-case scenarios rather than pretending everything is going to go wonderfully well, and I can assure listeners that if Australia is going to need a facility for the storage of large quantities of high-level nuclear waste, work on that should have started about 5 years ago. Now, for some related information coming from the OSMIN talks last week in Washington between the US and Australia, which again in his interview Paul Keating blasted, but which has received very little coverage in the rest of Australia. And I'm reading an excerpt here from the official document that says it was agreed that the next steps to advance our force posture cooperation include site surveys to scope upgrades at RAF Base Learmonth in support of potential upgrades for enhanced air cooperation, that's in caps for some reason, in addition to the locations announced last year, that's RAF Bases Sherga and Curtin. Support of more frequent rotations of US capability, including, get this list, including US Army watercraft, that's apparently building on the rotation announced at OSMIN last year. Next, bomber task force, then fighter jets, then maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft. I mean, the government is agreeing to turning Australia into a giant static aircraft carrier for the US as well as a future nuclear submarine base. And a final point, Australia and the United States agree to further our work on establishing a joint logistics area in Queensland, blah, 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 blah. Now, in many other countries, there would be riots in the streets about this sort of expansion, without any public consultation, coming as it does at the same time of the revelation by the US president of a secret political agreement regarding national security. But it just doesn't resonate here. And that's partly because of media indifference to the whole topic of national security. It's not the fault of the individual journalists, I know most of them personally, but rather the news organisations themselves. Editors around the country are fixated on the cost of living crisis and sort of associated economic news. Now, my means are actually quite modest, but I'm not preoccupied with supermarket prices, and even if I'm in a minority, that's still probably 40% of Australians who find more interest in watching the Food Network rather than the news. I don't have time to analyse the entire media industry, but influential newspapers such as The Australian have circled the wagons, and they're appealing only to their core readership, which is a diminishing number of angry old white men. The Sydney Morning Herald, which used to be a great paper of national record, is now very parochial, as is the Melbourne-based Age. The ABC has decided it wants to appeal to more women and has concluded that they have no interest in defence topics, so it's all about social issues with supermarket prices high on the list. And what this means collectively is that many of these issues, which I regard as extraordinarily important, are not being publicly aired. And the situation is actually even worse than that, because as I've said before, I also feel a sense of frustration that many politicians are let off the hook. When a journalist shoved a microphone in the face of Prime Minister Albanese about this Joe Biden letter, he instantly denied that there were further political agreements with the US, directly contradicting what the president has said. Where was the follow-up on that? There are only three possibilities. Either the Prime Minister is an idiot, or he's lying, or he doesn't know what his defence minister has been negotiating on the quiet with the Americans and the Brits. And I don't know, frankly, which of those three possibilities is the worst. Now, speaking of Richard Marles, I've noticed at least he has been backtracking a bit in the language, and like the Australian Submarine Agency head Vice Admiral Mead, he is now mentioning difficulties in acquiring second-hand Virginia-class submarines rather than the previous unsustainable rhetoric that it was inevitable that this is going to happen. But could someone, a journalist, anyone please, ask the obvious follow-up questions, such as what happens if the US cannot raise the build rate of Virginia SSNs to the required 2.33 per year? Surely someone has to answer that. And just saying the Americans are confident is absolutely no way to manage the defence of Australia. And as for the continuing appalling levels of secrecy in this country about everything connected with defence, I'm tempted to set up a new political party called Transparent Government, do a deal with the Teals and the Independents about preference swapping, get Malcolm Turnbull and his friends to help with fundraising, and take a few more seats off Labor at the next election. And that would include, hopefully, that of Corio, the current incumbent being Richard Marles, as well as campaigning on government transparency that would also have a secondary theme of less time on the golf course. Now, only then will Labor and the coalition get the message that what they are doing is just plain wrong. No ifs, no buts. And by the way, that's not a total pipe dream. The previously very safe rural Victorian seat of Indi was lost by the very dislikable Sophie Mirabella, who managed to whittle away a 15% advantage and have the seat go to an independent where it remains. Anyway, and now a return to reality. And I mentioned that I was planning to bring up the topic of David Sanger speaking at the National Press Club last week. I urge everyone to watch it. It's on YouTube, and he has an enormously impressive record. I'll just read very briefly from part of his biography that he is a White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times and one of the news organization's senior writers. In a 42-year reporting career at the Times, he has played central roles on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. In April, he published his 4th book, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and the Struggle to Defend the West. He is a sort of insider's insider and personally knows and speaks regularly with the US national security elite. He is included in discussions, and he is a sounding board for various extremely senior officials and political figures. His views are always worth listening to. He would know more about what's going on in Washington in the national security space than almost anyone else. Now, I had the chance to ask a question, and so I asked about the likelihood of a future US president authorizing the sale of these Virginia-class submarines to Australia. And to be honest, I was not in the slightest bit surprised to hear him state what I think has always been the obvious, namely, it might happen, but then again, it might not. And he mentioned that members of Congress might object to the US weakening its own position by agreeing to the deal. He went on to say that even if Australia did get the subs, they might already be obsolete. Another concern of mine, along with many others, who have dared to ask questions about AUKUS and seemingly the lack of research that has gone into the need for this capability, and no study at all, as far as I can tell, about the alternatives. Anyway, David Sanger spoke about conversations he has been having in the Pentagon about undersea warfare a decade from now, and he said, again, not especially surprisingly, that a huge amount of emphasis is now on uncrewed systems supported by artificial intelligence. This is the inside thinking of the Pentagon and the United States Navy. And he mentioned the possibility, sounds a bit science fiction-y, of uncrewed submersibles sitting on the ocean floor near Taiwan, remaining undetected and then surfacing during a conflict to fire weapons, that sort of stuff. So he really thinks that crewed submarines are coming to the end of their usefulness. And to its credit, the RAN is investing in some, I emphasize some, uncrewed systems, but they could be doing a whole lot more. As I said in the last episode, I think if they were smart, they would get into a joint development with South Korea. Now, I can only imagine how much stronger Australia would be, and also how much more independent, by the way, if we took all of that AUKUS submarine money and invested it in future technologies. And at the moment, unless I'm given a lot of information to the contrary, I feel we are in a situation of being something like in 1939 and investing half of the defense budget in a fleet of battleships. And of course, it was a year or two after that it was clear that battleships were just completely vulnerable to air power and disappeared from arsenals around the world. And I think that crewed submarines, particularly for deployments to hotly contested areas such as the South China Sea, will soon be a thing of the past. Anyway, that's all I've got time for today. As always, thank you for listening. Bye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.